Let me tell you about a couple I'll call Jim and Susan. They retired at 65 last year. They'd been planning for years, read the books, watched the videos, ran the numbers. And being careful planners, they built their plan around a piece of advice they'd heard. Retirement spending naturally tapers off as you get older. You spend less in your 70s than you did in your 60s, and you likely spend even less in your 80s than you did in your 70s. They built a plan that gradually stepped down over the years. Year one, that was supposed to be the biggest year, and every year after that was supposed to be slightly less. Then they finished their first year of retirement. Their spending was up 18%. They had taken that bucket list trip to Portugal. They helped one of their kids with a down payment on their house. They replaced both of their cars because both of their cars were old and they finally had time to deal with it. And throw in some dental work because this tends to happen. Jim and Susan looked at each other and said, "What did we do wrong?" Here's what happened. They believed a story about retirement that is true on average, but almost completely useless for any one individual planning their specific retirement. What happened to them in year one is more common than many retirees realize. Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to walk through the data and truly look at how spending unfolds for the typical retiree over the course of a retirement. But before I dig into the data, I want to call myself out on something. In many of the retirement projections I build, an assumption I often include is a gradual decline in spending over time. And I do that for a reason. For many affluent retirees, the data really is there to support it, that as retirement progresses, spending tends to decline. And I'll be the first to admit that that's a pretty simplistic way to look at it, because spending doesn't decline perfectly every single year. And, pause yourself for this revolutionary insight, not every retiree has the exact same life experience. Shocking, I know. So a baseline spending decline is a fine place for a starting projection. But it's not the whole story. The whole story is a bit more interesting. So let's walk through the most common spending patterns that the data shows us. And some of them look nothing like a gentle decline. If we anchor too tightly to this idea that retirement spending naturally declines as people age, that can make us feel like, hey, perhaps we don't need to worry too much about inflation over time, or something like the rule of 4% is going to give us more of a cushion than we really need. As I just admitted, there's real data behind that view. Spending does tend to decline on average, but the word doing all the heavy lifting in that sentence is average, and we have to be careful when we're looking at averages. So here's what the data says. 3 of the most cited studies on retirement spending come from the EBRI, the Employee Benefit Research Institute, from RAND, and from Rowe Price. Together, they give us a remarkably clear picture. The EBRI looked at thousands of retired households using the Health and Retirement Study and found that about 66% experienced a clear decline in spending in retirement. About 16% saw their spending actually increase, and the remaining roughly 18% stayed essentially flat. That same data, analyzed longitudinally by an economist, showed that median spending fell about 5.5% in the first 2 years of retirement and 14.1% by year 6. But here's the part we need to acknowledge. 45.9% of households actually spent more than they did pre-retirement in years 1 and 2. And 33.4% were still spending more after 5 to 6 years in. RAND's research backs up the average decline. After age 65, real spending falls about 1.7% per year for singles and about 2.4% per year for couples. And that decline shows up across every single wealth level. So that tells us something very important. It's not that people are running out of money. It's that life is simplifying. There's less of a need or a desire to spend as time goes on. Here's the cleanest summary I can give you all in one place. Spending declines in retirement for about 66% of retirees. Spending increases in retirement for about 16% of retirees, and it stays roughly stable or no clear directional changes for about 18% of retirees. Now let's take a closer look at those early retirement years. Notice something. On paper, the average spending declines. That's a fair summary. But look at how many people are in radically different camps. More than 1 in 5 retirees are spending well above their pre-retirement level 5 years in. More than half are spending below 80% of what they used to. The headline is technically true. It's just useless for planning your specific retirement. There's one more piece of research I want you to see, because I think it's the most important of all. Rowe Price looked at retirees' spending over rolling 2-year periods, and they didn't ask if their spending went up or down or stayed flat. They asked, how much did it change by? And the answers are pretty interesting. Roughly 1 in 4 retirees had spending jump 17 to 20% in a 2-year window. Another 1 in 4 had spending fall 20 to 21%. These were the same retirees, just different 2-year windows, and we get completely different stories. Between ages 65 and 90, more than half of retirees, 50.1%, experienced at least one spending increase between 0 and 25%. About 28% saw an increase between 25 and 50%, and 21.5% saw spending shoot up somewhere between 50 and 100% from one point to another. Now, this is a very important point. This does not mean that these retirees permanently increased or doubled their spending for the remainder of their retirement. The data is saying that at some point during retirement, spending temporarily or structurally surged relative to another period in retirement. Sometimes it's healthcare. Sometimes it's helping a family member. It could be moving. It could be a one-off repair. It could be widowhood. There are any number of reasons for these spending shocks. They can go up and down, but what it shows is that retirement spending does not happen in a straight line. So read that again. 1 in 5 retirees, somewhere between 65 and 90, will see their spending nearly double at some point. And this is what most retirement projections completely miss. They assume steady or similar spending from year to year, maybe making adjustments for inflation. But that's not what we see in real life. We see that spending jumps and dips and ebbs and flows and moves in all sorts of directions. So the cleanest way I can say this is retirement spending tends to decline on average. But almost no individual retiree experiences that decline smoothly every single year. Real households experience shocks. They experience healthcare expenses, they help their family members, they might experience a lifestyle transition, an unexpected trip, you name it. Real life does not happen in a straight line. Spending may drift downward over the course of a decade on average, but the true ride itself might be more chaotic. That means a retirement plan that assumes you'll spend roughly the same amount every single year for the next 30 years is almost certain to be wrong. But the question is, in which direction is it wrong, and by how much? Here's where the research gets pretty useful. Because while the spending paths vary, they aren't random. The data shows that there are factors that we can use to help determine which group you're more likely to land in. There are 6 of them, so let's walk through them. Number 1, higher income retirees often show the biggest declines. This one surprises a lot of people. You'd think wealthier retirees have more permission to have greater spending. But when we look at research from David Blanchett, and specifically in his research around the spending smile, he points out that it is the affluent retirees who tend to experience the greatest declines in spending over time. Now, why is that? It's simply because a lot of their spending was discretionary in the first place. They might have had more travel, more dining out, more hobbies that simply cost money, and those things taper with time. Meanwhile, lower income households tend to have flatter spending, and that's because a lot of their income is already going to the essentials, whether that's housing and utilities and healthcare, so we don't see as big of drops in this group. It stays more flat. If you're planning a high discretionary retirement, do not assume your spending stays flat forever. There's a real chance it falls meaningfully. especially after age 75, which means you might be able to spend more freely earlier than your spreadsheet wants you to. 70s and 80s are when that life tends to naturally slow down a bit more because the long flight gets harder. Going out to a restaurant in a crowded place, that can become more cumbersome, and maybe you just don't want to do it as much. So if you front load more of your spending in your 60s, you might be glad you did. Number 2, singles are more financially fragile than couples. The EBRI found that single retired households carry significantly higher spending to income ratios than couples. Singles have less flexibility, a higher healthcare burden per person, fewer economies of scale on housing and transportation, and less ability to absorb a shock. Couples can shift costs between two people, they can share fixed expenses, they can pivot together. Singles can't. If you're entering retirement single or planning for that possibility, because if you go in as a married couple, it's likely that one of you will pass away before the other, and now we have to deal with a widow situation, widow or widower. But if we get to this point, instead of panicking, plan ahead for it. Build in a bigger buffer so you can handle whatever life throws at you. This leads us naturally to our next point. Number 3, widowhood reshapes everything. This is truly one of the most under-discussed risks in retirement planning. When one spouse passes away, two things happen at once, and they don't cancel each other out. Household spending may drop, but all those fixed expenses, like housing, utilities, taxes, those barely move. And all of a sudden you lose one Social Security check. You do get to keep the higher of the two as a survivor benefit, but if there was a pension, we may lose that pension, or it may be decreased depending on how it was claimed and how it was structured. So the income usually drops. The income generally falls faster than the expenses, which can leave the surviving spouse, often women, in a much tighter budget than they had originally planned for, the budget they had planned for as a couple. A good retirement plan needs to model this scenario. When one spouse passes, we need to ensure that the surviving spouse has enough to have a quality life. Number 4, healthcare drives the biggest late life spending increases. This is where the famous go-go years, slow-go years, and no-go years framework comes in. Discretionary spending tends to fall in those slow go or those middle years of retirement, and for some retirees, they experience a late life uptick in spending, specifically circling around healthcare. Now, this is not all retirees, it's not even the average retiree, but for some retirees, this spike is real and it can be significant. I feel like this is so important to say. The late life spike is not universal. Many retirees never face catastrophic long-term care costs. Others get hit very hard. And here is where we need to plan for your specific situation, because looking at all the averages in the world doesn't pay for your long-term care expenses if you end up in that situation. Number 5, women face different retirement spending risks. The data here is less about month-to-month spending and more about retirement security. Women are more likely to outlive their savings. They're more likely to experience widowhood. They're more likely to retire with lower assets and lower Social Security, and more likely to have caregiving interruptions in their careers. So that combination, a longer time horizon, more spending shocks, more conservative buffers, can lead to women really holding back, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of fear in retirement. Sometimes they end up spending far more conservatively than they actually need to. And that leads us to our next point. Some spending declines aren't about money at all. Blanchett's work suggests something that's really important to see, and that's that many retirees slow down their spending simply because they want to. They want to travel less. They want to dine out less. They want to buy fewer clothes. They simply desire more simplicity as life goes on. And that distinction matters enormously, because if you assume that every retiree who cuts spending is doing it out of financial fear, you'll overbuild your safety margin. You'll underspend the years you could have been living. Then you'll spend the later years of your retirement realizing that you could have lived more. I've seen this happen more times than I can count. And in a lot of ways, it's heartbreaking because the money was there, but we just didn't have a strong enough plan in place that gave our retiree confidence to spend. Okay, so if retirement spending isn't a smooth line, what do you actually do? Well, there's a few things. First, stop treating retirement income as one number. The whole idea that I need exactly X dollars for the next 30 years is built on an assumption that doesn't play out in real life. You can't expect that your spending will stay flat for the next 30 years, maybe adjusting for inflation. All you can do is know that your spending will jump around and you want to build a plan that accounts for that. Second, separate essential spending from discretionary spending. Essentials are housing, food, healthcare, and basic transportation. These deserve more stable and predictable income sources, like Social Security, pensions, annuities, bond ladders. Discretionary spending, travel, hobbies, gifts, and kitchen renovations. This category can flex with market conditions and life conditions. So if the market experiences a big tumble, you can cut back in this area without causing a great amount of stress in your life. Third, build in guardrails. Instead of withdrawing the same inflation-adjusted amount, no matter what's happening in markets or in your life, use a withdrawal strategy that adjusts when your portfolio is doing well and when it isn't. Research on spending volatility shows us that this is how most real retirees behave anyway. And what can help enormously with this is having a written plan. That way, when the market is up or when the market is down, you have a plan that you can go to that gives you a set of steps rather than putting you in a state of reaction. Fourth, plan for the spending personalities you're most likely to land in. If you're entering into retirement with a significant amount of your budget dedicated to discretionary spending, it's probably safe to plan that you're going to have meaningful declines in your spending once you get to your late 70s or your 80s. If you're entering into retirement single, make sure you build in a bit of an extra buffer. That way your bases are covered. If you're entering into retirement as a couple, plan out what it looks like to be a widow or a widower. You want to make sure no matter what happens that you guys are covered and you have a strong plan in place. Don't let one of these unexpected, but most likely expected life events derail your plan. And finally, give yourself permission to spend in the years when you can. A lot of retirees spend the first phase of retirement worried about running out of money. And then they spend the later phases of retirement regretting all the things they didn't do. Spending falls in retirement partly because of money, partly because of healthcare, and partly, for a lot of people, because the energy and the ability to spend simply isn't there anymore. The go-go years are real, but they're also short, so plan accordingly. Now let's come back to Jim and Susan for a second. If they'd seen this research before they retired, the year one surprise wouldn't have been a surprise at all. They would have built a plan that started with a spending decline assumption, because that's still a reasonable place to start, but they wouldn't have treated it like a guarantee. They would have built in buffers that accounted for spikes that can come up along the way. They wouldn't have looked at retirement as one single, gently downward sloping path. Instead, they would have looked at retirement as the possibility of having multiple different paths and having a plan for each of these. The headline of retirement spending declines is true on average, but you are not average. You are a specific person with a specific income, with a specific lifestyle, living in a specific household. The data is wonderful, and use the data to build out the life that you want, but ultimately it has to reflect your specific situation. So yes, retirement spending falls on average. However, individual retirement spending tends to bounce, spike, dip, and shift. So plan for the real version, not the average. What are your thoughts on retiree spending? I'd love to hear. Post it in a comment down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. Trip to Portugal. Their lifestyle is simply simplifying. No. Family members and all of these things, all of the things, widowhood and caregiving, home repairs, travel. I just did all of that and the microphone wasn't even on.